In order for a musical composition to produce an effect of fullness, calmness and satisfaction, it has to be scored in a specific key which serves as the basis for the melody and harmony. The score will then be organized around the tonic note, which generates a sense of repose, in contrast to the dominant and subdominant notes which generate tension. The dialogue that every musical composition establishes with itself expresses an exchange between the state of repose and the state of tension, because its starting point is equivalent to the beginning of a journey that we plan as a concourse, even though the vicissitudes that delay the arrival at the destination soon appear. However, when this happens, we reach the fullness, satisfaction and repose sought, because everything is resolved with the final tonic note that brings calm again, and with it a profound dimension of aesthetic experience. Maturescence also implies an exchange between a state of repose and a state of tension, because the dominant and subdominant notes begin a different dialogue with the personal tonic note. Likewise, in maturescence, resolution also implies fullness, calmness and satisfaction, because it is often possible to recover the tonic note, renewing it. What impacts with the maturescent transformation is the possibility of reaffirming ourselves as composers of the score of our life. For this reason, we dedicate this work to everyone who wishes to become the composer of his or her own melody and harmony. For living maturescence.
The title of this paper puts the verb to live in brackets. This is because we want to propose the possibility of understanding each individual maturescent process characterized by a verb. Thus, instead of live, we could insert other verbs, such as enjoy, elaborate, desire, recover, resist, suffer, etc.
Maturescence can be understood as a time in the life cycle when deep currents stir the surface waters, arranged from mild turbulence to the violence of a tidal wave, provoking a disorientation that can lead the navigation of one's life to the urgency of course correction, to the risk of losing it, to the danger of shipwreck, although it can often also lead to the discovery of a different world. In any case, the difference is established by a firm hand on the rudder and the decision to reach port, as much as the possibility of taking advantage of the wind to sustain a course that promotes renewed satisfaction, the true purpose of maturescent transformation.
To understand maturescence, we propose a four-moment method of interpretation that we call the SBAT sequence: shock, bewilderment, acknowledgement and transformation, which follows a direction that is rooted in somatic life and ends up decanting into outbreaks of mood. The SBAT sequence involves crossing the four thresholds that separate each moment from each other. This SBAT sequence facilitates the description of the maturescent revolt in women and men, resulting in a resource that, when it flows, allows us to define the maturescent transition, and when it stagnates, it allows us to define the maturescent crisis. First moment, shock. This could be considered as the first aspect of the psychic upheaval, the perception that something strange, unknown until then, is happening impersonally, something to which an impersonal source is recognized. Something that bursts unexpectedly from the somatic functioning. Second moment, bewilderment. This is the second aspect of the actual revolt of the soul. Bewilderment leads to the sensation of personally experiencing something unknown that promotes an experience of perplexity and disorientation. acquiring an individual characteristic that will have to do with the identity and personal interests of the person who is experiencing it. Third moment, acknowledgement. This is the fundamental step to start a response to the shock and bewilderment, implying a new positioning based on the acknowledgement of the paradox and the uncertainty of living, given that they have something to say and are here to stay. It is an active exercise that allows personal identity and interests to be repositioned in order to achieve a measure of satisfaction and renewal. Fourth moment, transformation. It implies the culmination of the maturescent process, the achievement of growth and development that integrates the experience of the paradox and the uncertainty of living as core elements. Transformation can be defined as the acquisition of a proper sense for living, as a direct understanding of reality, as a way of passing through life in the present time, as an exercise of an active aging style. Of course, whether the SBAT sequence can flow or stagnate does not depend on chance or will, but on the capacity of each individual's available mental resources to promote this inner transformation.
Acme is a Greek word meaning the moment of maximum splendor, the zenith, the apogee, the climax of something or situation. Originally, the word acme was used to refer to the period of a person's greatest productivity, greatest notoriety and exposure, greatest achievement, but acme was also used to signify the moment of greatest existential fulfillment in the life cycle. Plato set physical fullness for men at 30, and for women at 20, and he set soul's one, that is the acme of the life cycle, at 50. Aristotle also established an age for this plenitude, considering that the body is at its fullness between 30 and 35 years of age, and the soul reaches its own at about 49. When we postulate maturescence as one of the most important moments of the life cycle, we are doing so by daring to continue Greek philosophical thought, since it coincides with the age of acme, or the age of true fullness of the human being.
When the SBAT sequence flows and completes its cycle, the individual accesses the culmination of the maturescent process by initiating a new stage of life that implies a direct understanding of reality. This process can be inferred using the metaphor of the Sirens Song in Homer's Odyssey, and the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, for they account for a confrontation that seeks individual answers to the question of the mysteries of life, among which is also the mystery of death.
First he will come to the sirens, who cast a spell on all men who come near them. He who approaches his ship without knowing it and hears the voice of the sirens will never be surrounded by his wife and tender children, full of joy because he has returned home. Rather, they bewitch him with their sonorous song as they sit in a meadow where they are surrounded by a great heap of rotting human bones, covered with dried skin. Make your ship pass by, and, melting wax as pleasant as honey, smear it in the ears of your companions so that none of them will hear them, but you, if you will hear them, let them bind you hand and foot, firm by the mast. Let them fasten the ropes to it, so that you may hear the voice of the two sirens with pleasure, and if you beg your companions to untie you, let them bind you still more with more ropes.
The Sirens Song seems to allude to the knowledge of the truths that individuals have to conquer by themselves, those truths that are not learned from books, that are not handed down from one person to another, but are conquered or wrestled from destiny by force. This is why the Sirens Song constitutes a trap that confuses the unwary with the offer of knowledge without personal effort, something that seems to lead to death. As Odysseus somehow senses this, He decides to listen to the Sirens Song with all the pain that confrontation may bring. That is why, instead of covering his own ears with wax, with which he could pass for the most common and simple human being who decides to give in, he chooses to confront the uncertain without veilings, to investigate the meaning of the Sirens Song by himself.
Plato begins episode 7 of Republic by relating that a group of prisoners from birth, chained to the wall by their necks and legs, are forced to look only forward, prevented from moving and looking backwards. They can only see a series of shadows with different images, which they can only take for real, because it is the only form of reality they have known up to that point. The shadows are cast by men who are hidden from the prisoner's view. These men carry banners in the shapes cast by the light of a fire against the backdrop of the cavern. The prisoners, who all their lives have only known this way of seeing reality, chained to the wall as they have always lived, give the value of reality to what they observe. At some point, the men decide that one of the prisoners should be led to the knowledge of reality. They proceed to set him free, and when he returns with the news that there is a different world outside the cavern to which they were chained from birth, he is murdered by his former fellow prisoners, who can neither give credence nor tolerate what he tells them.
The allegory of the cave leads us to the need to distrust our perception of reality. Thus posed, it would also be confirming that somewhere in our intimacy there is a recognition of our own delusions, because we are not one of the prisoners in Plato's cave. This is an example in which the free flow of the SBAT sequence would be fulfilled. The Truman Show focuses on the life of Truman Burbank, an ordinary and somewhat innocent man living in the idyllic village of Sea Haven. Truman is a happily married insurance salesman who is unaware that his life is part of a television show that is being recorded by sophisticated cameras and broadcast live around the world. For this reason he is never allowed to leave the confines of the village. Little by little, Truman discovers details that show him flaws in certain regularities, hints of the great discovery he will eventually make. For example, Truman notices that by waiting in a corner without moving and counting the people who pass by during a certain period of time, the same people regularly reappear. The same thing happens to his own wife when Truman discovers, in the midst of a marital dispute, that when she offers him his breakfast cereal, she always shows him the box in the same way and repeats an advertising formula she is reciting to the audience. But of course, fortunately, the same thing did not happen to Truman with Lauren's character, because they both feel attracted to each other and Lauren confesses to him that she has another name, that she too is a character like all the others, and that he has to run away from there, that everything he lives is a fiction prepared for a large audience. From that moment on, Truman has only one desire: to discover the truth and escape, or perhaps the other way round, to escape in order to discover the truth. Here we also raise a paradox, because Truman may find himself in the real world with miseries equivalent to those he experienced in his life during the film set. We see Truman's effort to acknowledge reality as equivalent to the effort made by any maturescent individual who has at his disposal the possibility of the free flow of the SBAT sequence towards authentic transformation. A literary example of the free flowing of the SBAT sequence can be found in Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway. Here we find someone at a very special moment in her life, striving to find her own answers to the riddle of existence, a kind of answers that include her past and her future, yet focusing on what she is living at that moment in her present.
Mrs. Dalloway is a novel set on a single day in the life of its central character, Clarissa Dalloway, who is about to turn 52. Clarissa is preparing for a party to be held that evening at her London home, and she is anxious, worried and expectant about it. She looks in the mirror because she knows how dangerous it is to have spent a lifetime waiting for just one thing, her party. She sets out to dazzle, to arouse admiration, to be the center of her own party. The plot would seem to be a mental soliloquy of Clarissa, who is presented as a woman who has adapted to the convention of being Mrs. Dalloway. She had long since ceased to be simply Clarissa, a young woman full of life and illusions who had an everlasting love that continued to represent over the years a symbol of all she had lived through. But she suddenly discovers that her body represents nothing to her, feeling invisible, unknown to herself. All what remains is to be just Mrs. Dalloway. Clarissa feels she has betrayed herself. It is perhaps for this reason that her inner monologue constantly takes her back to her youth, rethinking and recalling her entire life story, and, in her soliloquy, she often condenses the past with the present. The mirror is one of her favorite interlocutors with whom she talks about what she feels she has lost. She had stopped feeling emotions, even though she remembered the fullness with which she had lived in the past. This description of the maturescent Clarissa in front of the mirror depicts current with past image comparison during maturescence. Clarissa begins by lamenting the vitality she feels she has lost and ends by remembering the fullness of past moments. She wonders whether waking up every day, seeing the sun, walking in the park, meeting friends would not be enough to make life meaningful. What else would it take to be happy? In a way, Clarissa thus mixes the awareness of finitude with the experience of fulfillment. It can therefore be thought that Clarissa attempts and promotes a real elaboration of the emotional revolt that activates the implementation of the SBAT sequence.
When the SBAT sequence becomes stagnant and it is difficult or impossible to let it flow and complete the cycle, a certain emotional regression appears. This positioning leads to an indirect understanding of reality, which is why answers emerge functioning as a false consolation, as if a mirror were activated to distort the reality of what it has in front of it to reflect. The result is that the question about the mysteries of life, among which is also the mystery of death, can only be answered in vain. Vladimir Nabokov's novel Lolita is a frequent archetype of the love, passion and desperation of some maturescent individuals for pubescent girls. The story introduces the character HH, who alludes to his real passion for pubescent girls between the ages of 9 and 14 by calling them nymphets. The nymphomaniacs would then be maturescent men desperate to find girls who possess the fascinating gift of exciting and irrepressible sexual desire, evidence of the inner failure of those who cannot authentically channel what they desire. The couple thus articulated between the nymphet and the older man establishes an inversely proportional relationship between the eruption of adolescent sexuality, that emotional upheaval caused by puberty, and the onset of somatic collapse, that emotional upheaval caused by the climacteric period. The character HH represents an example of someone who chooses the wrong verb. Instead of living maturescence, he seems to have chosen to suffer his own maturescence. We also want to consider what we call deviance of thought that led to an indirect understanding of maturescence. Among these deviants of thought we rank what we call the expression of experience as a resistance. It is very common to hear that the years bring experience, as if life experience was something coming from the outside in. We think that experience is something that is acquired, but not by the simple fact of being alive, but by the effort of living. We know that euphemisms are expressions that aim to soften a generally strong and contrasting affective content linked to issues related to sexuality and death. we propose the use of euphemisms as a defensive modality to avoid direct contact with reality, to avoid calling things by their name. Another of the deviants of thought may be found in what is called common sense, something that makes one's own subjectivity invisible, and we propose to change it for a nomenclature that we prefer to call proper sense. These truths of common sense have no value if they are compared to the truths of proper sense. Commonplaces and proverbs, which end up emptying of content those truths that they pretend to transmit, which are taken for granted beforehand, are also forms that make evident another of these deviants of thought that avoid direct contact with reality. Finally, we want to focus on the difference between having and being. There are people who need to have because they unfortunately cannot be, while there are others who have, but precisely because they are. That is, they can have what they dream of and what they desire precisely because they dare to be themselves. This deviance of thought that led to an indirect understanding of maturescence is something we propose as part of a work that has to lead to a direct confrontation with reality. This direct confrontation leads to what we call an active aging with a verve, contrary to the perspective provided by deviance of thought that led to a passive aging.
The counterpart of the deviance of thought could be called the search for a proper meaning, that which promotes an openness towards different and personalized destinies, a characteristic of an authentic maturescent transformation. By way of example, we choose the postulates of Stoic philosophy, because the Stoic attitude seems to us valuable for a direct understanding of maturescence. The first of all the Stoic principles, formulated as living in accordance with nature, summarizes the idea that the human being can only be understood if we define individuals on the basis of their relationship to nature. Whoever is able to adapt to his own nature, to become independent of external contingency, will achieve peace of mind and consequent happiness. Stoic philosophy holds that nature makes all human beings equal because from birth it makes them all identical. From this principle, Stoicism also becomes an educational thought for the individual to do what his soul dictates, because it proposes that it is not about living to know, but knowing to live. It occurred to us to summarize the series of principles that can be valuable for a direct understanding of maturescence, starting from the works of the Stoic philosophers Seneca, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. We propose a series of core meanings that seem to flow naturally from the paradox and the uncertainty of living during maturescence. Life has to be lived in the present tense. Worrying about the past and the future leads to unhappiness. The acknowledgement of an inner space and an inner life contributes to the acquisition of a proper sense for existence. Individual human life can only be understood as a point in space and an instant between two eternities. The necessity of the recognition of death in everyday life promotes true strength. Early recognition of the values of old age implies a way of life. Let us look at just a few examples from each of these authors. We are not to be concerned with living long years, but with living them satisfactorily, for to live long depends on fate, while to live satisfactorily depends on your soul. Life is long if it is full, and it becomes full when the soul has regained possession of its own good and has transferred to itself the mastery of itself. All things we fear as mortals, all things we desire as immortals. Do not want events to happen as you will, but want events as they happen and you will live serene. Men are disturbed not by things, but by opinions about things, like death, which is nothing terrible but the opinion about death, that it is something terrible. that is the terrible thing. So when we suffer hindrances or become sad, let us never put the blame on another, but on ourselves, that is, on our opinions. In the vastness of space the earth is but a point, stigma. In the vastness of time our life is but an instant, a tiny apparition between the abysses of two eternities, bordered by infinite time. To no quieter, more peaceful place does man retreat than into his own soul, especially he who has within him such resources that, if he examines them, at once he finds himself in total well-being. Therefore, grant yourself this retreat without ceasing, and renew yourself.
By way of closing the journey we have just shared, we will present a synthesis for understanding maturescence. For this reason we are going to postulate an A and a B side of maturescence. It is very different to think about what the individual does with the years than what the years do with the individual. It is very important to differentiate what we postulate as active aging from what we can call passive aging. This approach also differentiates a direct understanding of maturescence from an indirect understanding of maturescence. The former implies a confrontation with reality, while the latter implies a denial of reality. We consider that the direct understanding of maturescence implies a preponderance of a proper sense for living, far removed from the preponderance of what is usually called common sense. This direct understanding of maturescence implies an inside-out positioning, whereas indirect understanding of maturescence implies an outside-in positioning. We propose a direct understanding of maturescence that focuses on the latent content of aging, as opposed to an indirect understanding of maturescence that focuses on the manifest content of aging. The factors we want to align on side A of maturescence promote openness to the paradox and the uncertainty of living, while the factors we can align on side B are those that promote a soul closure that leads to what we might call the shadows of self, deception. We believe that a direct understanding of maturescence sets the SBAT sequence in motion and allows it to flow freely, while those factors that propose an indirect understanding of maturescence are those that will hinder the free flow and the natural course of the SBAT sequence: shock, bewilderment, acknowledgement and transformation.